The manila envelope containing my resignation letter sits perfectly centered on Marcus's mahogany desk. My company key card placed deliberately on top like a period at the end of a sentence I should have written years ago. Through his glass office door, I can see him frozen in the conference room, his face a mask of dawning horror as he processes what Sarah from HR is quietly explaining to him. His eyes dart to his desk, then to the empty space where my workstation used to be, then back to Sarah's sympathetic but firm expression. The crystalline clarity I've felt since walking out of my own birthday party 12 hours ago remains unshaken, even as I watch the man I once loved, the man I built my entire professional life around, realize that his carefully constructed world is crumbling. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really began, because the birthday party wasn't the beginning. It was simply the final straw in a haystack I'd been carrying on my back for 3 excruciating years. I met Marcus Brennan during my second week at Brennan and Associates Marketing, the mid-sized firm he'd inherited from his father. I was 26, fresh from a smaller agency, eager to prove myself in a more prestigious environment. He was 31, devastatingly handsome, in that effortless way that comes with generational wealth, and possessed of a confidence that seemed to make every room bend around him. "You're the new strategic director," he'd said, appearing at my cubicle with 2 cups of coffee and a smile that made my stomach flutter. "I'm Marcus. I know we haven't officially met, but I wanted to personally welcome you to the team." It wasn't just that he was attractive, though he undeniably was, with his dark hair perpetually tousled just so, and his expensive suits that fit like they were painted on. It was the way he seemed genuinely interested in my ideas, the way he'd stop by my desk to discuss campaigns, the way he made me feel like my perspective mattered in a way my previous boss never had. The transition from professional respect to personal affection happened gradually, then all at once. Late nights working on the Morrison account turned into dinners at upscale restaurants. Brainstorming sessions evolved into long conversations about our dreams, our fears, our philosophies on everything from market psychology to the meaning of life. When he kissed me for the first time in his office after we'd landed our biggest client of the year, it felt inevitable, like we'd been moving toward that moment since the day we met. "I want you to know," he'd whispered against my lips, "this doesn't change anything professional. You're here because you're brilliant, not because of this." I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. The first year was intoxicating. Marcus was attentive, romantic, generous with both his time and his praise. He took me to charity galas where I met the city's elite, introduced me as his incredibly talented director, with genuine pride in his voice. He sent flowers to my apartment on random Tuesdays, planned surprise weekend getaways to his family's cabin in the mountains, made me feel like I was living in a romantic comedy where the heroine gets both the perfect job and the perfect man. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. It started with small things. Marcus would interrupt me in meetings, finishing my sentences with ideas that weren't quite what I'd been about to say. When I'd try to correct or clarify, he'd wave me off with an indulgent smile and continue speaking. "Emma always has such interesting perspectives," he'd tell clients, in a tone that suggested my ideas were charming but not particularly serious. The interruptions became more frequent. In brainstorming sessions, my contributions were acknowledged with non-committal nods before the conversation moved on to suggestions from male colleagues, suggestions that were often variations of ideas I'd proposed moments earlier. When I pointed this out to Marcus privately, he looked genuinely confused. "Sweetheart, you're being a little paranoid," he'd said, using the pet name that had once made me melt but now felt somehow diminishing. "Everyone respects your input. You just need to be more assertive." So I tried to be more assertive. I spoke louder, interrupted less, prepared more thoroughly for every meeting. But the harder I pushed, the more I was labeled as difficult or aggressive. Marcus began having quiet conversations with me about my communication style and the importance of team harmony. Meanwhile, our personal relationship began to mirror these professional dynamics. Marcus started making decisions about our social calendar without consulting me, canceling plans we'd made together if something more interesting came up with his friends. When I expressed frustration, he'd remind me that his schedule was more complicated than mine, that he had more responsibilities, that I needed to be more understanding of the pressures he faced as a business owner. You knew what you were getting into when we started dating, he'd say, not unkindly, but with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. This company is my life. I need a partner who supports that, not someone who creates additional stress. The most insidious part was how reasonable he made it all sound. Marcus never yelled, never called me names, never exhibited the obvious red flags I'd been taught to watch for. Instead, he eroded my confidence with 1,000 small cuts, each one delivered with such calm logic that I began to doubt my own perceptions. When he started working late with Jessica, the new account manager he'd hired 6 months into our relationship, I told myself I was being jealous and insecure. When he began excluding me from client dinners that had previously been automatic invitations, I accepted his explanation that it was better to keep our professional and personal lives separate. When he stopped initiating physical intimacy and seemed distracted when I did, I convinced myself he was just stressed about the quarterly numbers. The second year was a masterclass in gaslighting, though I wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. Every concern I raised was reframed as evidence of my own insecurity or inadequacy. Every boundary I tried to establish was dismissed as unreasonable or controlling. Every success I achieved was minimized, while every mistake was magnified and dissected. "I'm just trying to help you grow," Marcus would say when I'd express hurt over his constant criticism. "If I didn't care about your development, I wouldn't invest this much time in your feedback." But the feedback was never constructive. It was a relentless focus on my shortcomings, delivered with the clinical detachment of a supervisor, rather than the love of a partner. I was too emotional, too reactive, too sensitive. I took things too personally, overthought simple situations, created drama where none existed. The most devastating part was how he weaponized my own ambitions against me. He knew I wanted to be promoted to senior director, knew I'd been working toward that goal since before we'd started dating. So when the position opened up and went to David Chen, a recent hire with half my experience, Marcus explained it as a question of readiness and cultural fit. "You're incredibly talented, Em," he'd said over dinner at the expensive restaurant he'd chosen to deliver this news, as if the setting could soften the blow. "But you still have some areas to work on before you're ready for that level of responsibility. David has a more collaborative leadership style that's better suited to our current team dynamic." Translation: David was a man who wouldn't challenge Marcus's authority or question his decisions. David would be grateful for the opportunity rather than viewing it as something he'd earned through merit. That night, I cried until I had no tears left, then spent hours staring at the ceiling and questioning everything I thought I knew about my own abilities. Had I been deluding myself about my competence? Was I really as difficult to work with as Marcus suggested? Maybe I was too ambitious, too pushy, too unwilling to wait my turn. The third year was when I began to disappear entirely. Not physically, I showed up to work every day, sat through endless meetings, completed projects that were praised by clients and then somehow credited to other team members. But the version of myself that had walked into Brennan and Associates 3 years earlier, confident and eager and full of ideas, gradually faded into someone I didn't recognize. I stopped speaking up in meetings unless directly asked for input. I stopped proposing new strategies or challenging existing approaches. I became the competent, invisible worker bee that Marcus seemed to prefer. Productive enough to be valuable, but quiet enough not to cause problems. Our personal relationship followed the same trajectory. I stopped bringing up issues that bothered me, stopped asking for changes to plans I didn't like, stopped expressing needs that Marcus found inconvenient. I became the low-maintenance girlfriend he'd always wanted, available when he needed me, invisible when he didn't. The irony was that the more I diminished myself to fit his preferences, the less interested he seemed in me altogether. Our conversations became perfunctory exchanges about schedules and logistics. Our dates became increasingly infrequent, and when they did happen, Marcus spent most of the time on his phone or talking about work. Our physical relationship dwindled to the occasional dutiful encounter that left me feeling more alone than if we hadn't touched at all, but I stayed. I stayed because leaving felt impossible, because I'd invested so much of myself in this relationship and this job that walking away would mean admitting I'd wasted 3 years of my life. I stayed because Marcus had convinced me that my perceptions were unreliable, that my expectations were unreasonable, that my problems were of my own making. Most of all, I stayed because I genuinely believed that if I could just be better, more supportive, less demanding, more understanding of his pressures, we could get back to the way things had been in the beginning. I should have known better. I should have seen the signs for what they were, should have trusted my instincts instead of his explanations. But Marcus was brilliant at making his neglect feel like my failure, his indifference like my inadequacy. The birthday party was supposed to be different. For weeks leading up to my 29th birthday, Marcus had been unusually attentive. He asked what I wanted to do, made suggestions about venues, even offered to handle the planning himself, something he'd never done for any of my previous birthdays during our relationship. "I know I've been distracted lately," he'd said, taking my hands across the kitchen table in his penthouse apartment. "The Henderson merger has been consuming everything, but I want to make this special for you. You deserve that." The acknowledgement felt like a revelation. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope that maybe we were turning a corner, that maybe the man I'd fallen in love with was still there, underneath all the stress and distance. We decided on Rosewood, the upscale restaurant where we'd had our first official date 3 years earlier. Marcus made reservations for 8 people, close friends from work and my small circle of college friends who still lived in the city. It felt intimate but celebratory, exactly the kind of evening I'd been craving. I spent the entire day of my birthday in a state of nervous excitement. I got my hair done at the salon Marcus had recommended, bought a new dress in the deep blue he'd once said was his favorite color on me, even splurged on expensive perfume I couldn't really afford. For the first time in months, I felt beautiful, desirable, worthy of celebration. Marcus picked me up at 7, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal suit I'd helped him choose for a client presentation months earlier. He complimented my dress, kissed my cheek, held my hand in the car, all the small gestures that had once been automatic but had become increasingly rare. "I have a surprise for you," he said as we pulled up to the restaurant. "Someone special wanted to help us celebrate." My heart skipped. I imagined my sister flying in from Portland, or maybe my college roommate Sarah, who'd moved to London for work. Marcus knew how much I missed having family nearby, how isolated I sometimes felt in a city where most of my social connections were through him. We walked into Rosewood, hand in hand, and I spotted our table immediately. The group was already assembled, glasses raised in anticipation of a toast. But there was someone sitting next to Marcus's chair who made my blood freeze in my veins. Natalya Ivanova, Marcus's ex-girlfriend, the woman he'd dated for 2 years before me, the woman whose pictures still occasionally surfaced in his social media memories, the woman he'd assured me was completely in the past, but somehow seemed to pop up at the most inconvenient moments. "Surprise," Marcus said, his arm tightening around my waist as if he could feel my body going rigid. "Nat's in town for a conference, and when I mentioned your birthday, she insisted on coming to celebrate. Isn't that sweet?" Sweet. That's what he called bringing his ex-girlfriend to my birthday dinner. Natalya stood up from her seat. My seat, I realized with growing horror, the place of honor next to Marcus, and embraced me with the kind of confident warmth that only comes from knowing you hold all the power in a situation. "Emma," she exclaimed, her accent making my name sound exotic and sophisticated in a way my own voice never could. "You look absolutely stunning. Marcus has told me so much about you." She was exactly as beautiful as I remembered from the few times our paths had crossed at industry events. Tall and willowy, where I was average height and curvy, blonde and elegant, where I was brunette and approachable, sophisticated in that effortless European way that made American women like me feel clunky and overdressed. "Nat was just telling us about her new agency in Prague," said Jessica, the account manager Marcus had hired during our second year. "She's working with some incredible clients." And there it was, the carefully orchestrated setup. This wasn't a coincidence or a last-minute addition. This was planned. Marcus had invited his successful, glamorous ex-girlfriend to my birthday dinner so she could regale our mutual friends with stories of her fabulous career, while I sat there like a supporting character in my own celebration. "Marcus," I said quietly, pulling him aside as the group settled back into their conversations. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, sweetheart," he said, but his tone was already defensive, already preparing to dismiss whatever concern I was about to raise. We stepped toward the bar, far enough from the table to avoid being overheard, but still within sight of our guests. I could feel everyone watching us, could sense their curiosity about the little drama unfolding. "Why didn't you tell me you'd invited Natalya?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the storm of emotions churning in my chest. Marcus's expression shifted into the patient, slightly condescending look I'd come to know so well. "I told you someone special wanted to celebrate with us. I thought you'd be pleased that she made the effort to be here." "On my birthday, Marcus, you invited your ex-girlfriend to my birthday dinner without telling me." "Ex-girlfriend from 4 years ago," he corrected, as if the timeline made it less significant. "Nat and I are friends now, mature adults who can maintain professional relationships despite past romantic history. I thought you understood that." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost bought it. Almost convinced myself that I was being petty and jealous, that a truly confident woman would welcome her boyfriend's ex with grace and sophistication. Almost. But then I caught sight of our table where Natalya was holding court, gesturing elegantly as she told some story that had everyone laughing. She was sitting in my chair at my birthday dinner, being celebrated by my friends while I stood at the bar being lectured about maturity by the man who'd orchestrated this humiliation. "I want her to leave," I said quietly. Marcus's eyebrows shot up in genuine surprise. "Emma, that's incredibly rude. She came all this way to celebrate with you." "To celebrate with you," I corrected. "She came to see you, on my birthday, in front of all our friends and colleagues." "You're being paranoid again," Marcus said, his voice taking on that clinical tone he used when he wanted to make me feel crazy. "Nat is here as a friend. If you can't handle that level of social complexity, maybe we should discuss whether you're ready for the kind of life I lead." And there it was. The threat that lurked beneath every argument we'd had for the past year. The implication that I wasn't sophisticated enough, wasn't confident enough, wasn't enough period to be with someone like him. And I looked back at the table one more time. Natalya had pulled out her phone and was showing everyone pictures of something. Probably her gorgeous Prague apartment, or her glamorous clients, or her exciting European lifestyle. Everyone was leaning in, entranced, including David, Chen, and Jessica, the colleagues who barely acknowledged my ideas in meetings but hung on every word of the woman Marcus used to sleep with. In that moment, something crystallized inside me with perfect, terrible clarity. This wasn't about Natalya. This wasn't even about the birthday dinner. This was about 3 years of being systematically diminished, 3 years of having my reality questioned and my worth devalued. 3 years of being made to feel grateful for scraps of attention from a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient placeholder until something better came along. Natalya wasn't just a guest at my birthday dinner. She was a message. A reminder of what Marcus really valued, what he really wanted, what I would never be allowed to become as long as I stayed in his orbit. "You're right," I said, my voice steady and calm in a way that seemed to surprise him. "I'm not ready for this kind of life." I walked back to the table where 7 people looked up at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to poorly concealed pity. Marcus followed close behind, clearly expecting me to apologize, to smooth things over, to play the role of the gracious hostess who welcomes unwelcome guests with a smile. Instead, I picked up my purse from where I'd placed it beside my chair, the chair Natalya was still occupying. "I'm sorry, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the intimate space. "I need to leave. Please, stay and enjoy dinner. The reservations are paid for." "Emma," Marcus started, his voice sharp with warning. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate with me," I continued, ignoring him completely. "It means more than you know." I looked directly at Natalya, who was watching this unfold with the fascinated attention of someone observing an interesting social experiment. "Enjoy your evening," I told her with perfect politeness. "I'm sure you and Marcus have a lot to catch up on." Then I turned and walked out of Rosewood with my head held high, leaving behind the sound of shocked murmurs and Marcus's voice calling my name with increasing urgency. The January air was bitter cold, but I barely felt it as I walked the 12 blocks back to my apartment. With each step, the fog that had clouded my judgment for 3 years lifted a little more. By the time I reached my building, I could see my situation with startling clarity. I was 29 years old, professionally stagnant, romantically miserable, and so isolated from my own instincts that I'd been questioning my sanity rather than trusting my perceptions. I'd allowed myself to become a supporting character in my own life, grateful for whatever attention and opportunities Marcus deemed appropriate to share. But I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't too sensitive or too demanding or too anything. I was a woman whose intelligence had been systematically undermined, whose contributions had been consistently devalued, whose very presence had become an inconvenience to the man who claimed to love her. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, it felt like taking my first real breath in years. I spent that night doing something I hadn't done in longer than I could remember. I made plans that had nothing to do with Marcus's schedule, his preferences, or his approval. I pulled out my laptop and began researching job opportunities at competing firms. I looked up the contact information for the headhunter who'd tried to recruit me 8 months earlier, back when I'd still had enough confidence to believe I might be worth recruiting. Most importantly, I began drafting my resignation letter. Not the emotional, accusatory screed that part of me wanted to write, but a professional, courteous notice that gave the required 2 weeks and offered to help train my replacement. I kept it simple, factual, impossible to argue with or dismiss. I didn't expect Marcus to make it easy. I knew him well enough to predict exactly how he'd respond to losing control of the narrative. But for the first time in 3 years, I didn't care about managing his emotions or protecting his ego. I cared about protecting myself. My phone started ringing at 11:47 p.m. Marcus, of course, probably calling from his car after dropping Natalya off at her hotel. I let it go to voicemail, then deleted the message without listening to it. He called 6 more times that night. I deleted those messages too. By morning, I had a plan. I woke up early, earlier than I'd gotten up for anything in months, and felt more energized than I had in years. I showered, chose my most professional outfit, and arrived at the office a full hour before anyone else. The security guard looked surprised to see me so early on a Saturday morning, but I'd used weekend access before when working on urgent projects. I had work to do. First, I backed up all my personal files, deleting anything that belonged to the company but saving the portfolio pieces I'd need for job interviews. I organized my current projects into neat folders with detailed notes about status and next steps, the kind of thorough documentation that would make the transition easier for whoever inherited my workload. Then I cleaned out my desk, packing 3 years' worth of personal items into a small cardboard box. The framed photo of Marcus and me at last year's company retreat went into the trash, along with the expensive pen set he'd given me for my last birthday and the motivational books he'd recommended when he decided I needed to work on my mindset. I kept only the things that were truly mine. The small succulent my sister had sent when I got promoted to director, the coffee mug from my favorite bookstore, the award I'd won from the Marketing Association for the campaign that had landed us the Morrison account, the campaign Marcus had somehow managed to take credit for in the final presentation. By 8 a.m., my desk was bare except for my computer, a neat stack of project files, and the manila envelope containing my resignation letter. I could have waited. I could have scheduled a meeting for Monday morning, gone through the proper channels, given Marcus time to prepare his response. But I'd spent 3 years prioritizing his comfort over my own well-being, and I was done. I placed the envelope in the center of his desk, along with my company keycard, my building access fob, and the emergency credit card he'd given me for work expenses. Everything that tied me to this place, to him, to the life I'd been living in smaller and smaller circles. Then I walked out. I was halfway to my car when I heard my name being called across the parking garage. Marcus's voice, sharp with panic and authority, the tone he used when he expected immediate compliance. 6 months ago, hell, 6 hours ago, that tone would have stopped me in my tracks. I would have turned around, apologized for leaving without explanation, allowed myself to be drawn into a conversation where he'd convinced me I was being rash and emotional and unreasonable. But something had fundamentally shifted inside me during those long hours of clarity. The woman who would have responded to that commanding voice was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. I kept walking. "Emma!" Marcus called again, his voice closer now, footsteps echoing off concrete as he hurried to catch up. "Emma, stop. We need to talk about this." I reached my car and turned around. Marcus stood 10 feet away, still in the same charcoal suit from last night, his hair disheveled and his usually perfect appearance showing signs of stress. He looked like he hadn't slept, which gave me a petty sort of satisfaction. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, calmly, clicking the button to unlock my car doors. "Don't be ridiculous," Marcus said, stepping closer with the confident assumption that proximity would somehow restore his influence over me. "You're upset about last night, I understand that. But leaving like this, disappearing, not returning my calls, this isn't like you." "You're right," I agreed. "It's not like me. The me you've known for the past 3 years would have stayed at that dinner, smiled through the humiliation, and probably ended up apologizing to Natalya for making things awkward, but I'm not that person anymore." Marcus's expression shifted through several emotions: confusion, irritation, calculation, before settling on the patronizing sympathy he always used when he wanted to make me feel childish. "Sweetheart, you're clearly exhausted and emotional. Let's go get some coffee and talk this through like adults. I'm sure we can work everything out." The dismissive endearment, the assumption that my decision was based on temporary emotion rather than clear-eyed assessment, the casual certainty that he could talk me out of my own conclusions. It was all so perfectly Marcus that I almost laughed. "I quit," I said simply. "My resignation letter is on your desk, along with my company property. I've documented all my current projects and left detailed notes for whoever takes over my accounts." "You can't quit," Marcus said, his voice taking on an edge of genuine alarm. "We're in the middle of the Henderson merger. The Morrison account review is next month. You have responsibilities." "I gave 2 weeks' notice," I replied. "That's more consideration than you've shown me in the past year." "This is about Natalya," Marcus said, his tone shifting into accusation. "You're throwing away your career because you're jealous of my friendship with someone I dated years ago. Do you realize how that makes you look?" There it was. The attempt to make my reasonable boundaries seem like evidence of my inadequacy. 3 years ago, it might have worked. Even 3 hours ago, I might have questioned myself, wondered if I was being petty or immature or professionally self-destructive. But standing in that parking garage, looking at the man who'd spent our entire relationship convincing me to doubt my own perceptions, I felt nothing but calm certainty. "This isn't about Natalya," I said. "This is about you bringing your ex-girlfriend to my birthday dinner without telling me, then making me feel crazy for being upset about it. This is about 3 years of having my ideas dismissed, my contributions minimized, and my concerns gaslit. This is about dating someone who treats me like an inconvenience he has to manage, rather than a partner he values." Marcus's face went through another series of calculations, and I could practically see him shifting strategies, reaching for a different approach. "Emma, I love you," he said, his voice softening into the gentle, persuasive tone that had once made my knees weak. "I know I haven't been the best boyfriend lately, but I've been under enormous pressure with the business. Things will be different after the Henderson deal closes. We can take that vacation we've been talking about, spend some real time together." "When?" I asked. "When exactly did we talk about taking a vacation together?" Marcus paused, clearly trying to remember a conversation that had never happened. "I've suggested trips several times," he said, but with less conviction now. "You've mentioned taking trips," I corrected. "Golf weekends with your college friends, business conferences in cities you wanted to visit, the ski house your family rents every year where I'm invited as an afterthought if someone else cancels. When have you ever planned a vacation for just the two of us?" The question hung in the cold air between us, and Marcus's silence was answer enough. "The truth is," I continued, "you don't love me. You love having me available when it's convenient, invisible when it's not. You love having someone to manage your personal life without requiring much attention or investment. You love the idea of a girlfriend who makes you look good without challenging you or expecting too much." "That's not," Marcus started, but I held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not angry anymore," I said, and realized it was true. The fury that had sustained me through the long night had burned away, leaving behind something cleaner and stronger. "I'm just done. I'm done trying to be smaller so you can feel bigger. I'm done apologizing for having needs and expectations. I'm done pretending that being with you is better than being alone." Marcus stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language, like the woman standing in front of him was a stranger wearing his girlfriend's face. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, falling back on the threat that had always worked before. "You'll regret this. Do you know how hard it's going to be to find another position at this level? I've protected you here, vouched for you when others questioned your readiness for leadership. Without that support, I might actually discover what I'm capable of," I finished. "I might find out who I am when I'm not constantly being told who I should be." I opened my car door and got behind the wheel. Marcus stood frozen in the parking garage, clearly at a loss for how to respond to this version of me he'd never encountered before. "Don't call me," I said through the open window. "Don't text me. Don't show up at my apartment. If you need anything related to work, you can contact me through HR during business hours for the next 2 weeks. After that, we have nothing to discuss." I drove away without looking back, leaving Marcus standing alone among the concrete pillars and fluorescent lights, finally experiencing what it felt like to have someone walk away from him, rather than the other way around. The next 2 weeks were among the most professionally productive and personally liberating of my life. I worked remotely, which the company policy allowed, and which Marcus couldn't override without causing uncomfortable questions from HR. I completed my outstanding projects, trained my temporary replacement via video calls, and maintained scrupulous professionalism in all my interactions. Marcus tried to violate my boundaries exactly twice. Once he showed up at my apartment building on a Thursday evening, buzzing my intercom with increasing persistence until Mrs. Chen from 3B told him to leave or she'd call the police. The second time, he sent flowers to my apartment with a card that read, "Let's talk like adults." I donated the flowers to the assisted living facility down the street and blocked his number from my phone. But the most important thing I did during those 2 weeks was something I hadn't done in years. I started putting myself first. I called the headhunter who'd tried to recruit me months earlier. Marissa Klein was the founder of Klein Executive Search, a boutique firm that specialized in marketing and communications professionals. When I'd first spoken with her, I'd been too afraid of Marcus's reaction to seriously consider leaving. Now, I was ready to hear what she had to say. "Emma Chen," Marissa said when I identified myself on the phone. "I was beginning to think you'd disappeared from the industry entirely. Are you finally ready to explore some new opportunities?" We met for coffee on a Wednesday afternoon, and within 10 minutes, I knew I'd made the right choice. Marissa was sharp, direct, and refreshingly honest about the market and my prospects. "Your portfolio is excellent," she said, reviewing the materials I'd brought. "The Morrison campaign in particular shows real strategic thinking. But I have to ask, why are you leaving Brennan and Associates? 3 years is a good run, but you haven't been promoted beyond director level. For someone with your skills, that's unusual." I'd prepared for this question, but I'd also decided to be honest in a way I hadn't been with myself for years. "I was in a relationship with the owner," I said simply. "It created complications that limited my professional growth." Marissa nodded without surprise or judgment. Office romances rarely end well for the person with less institutional power. Are you prepared for the questions that might come up during the reference check process? I've been documenting my contributions to every major project for the past 3 years, I said. I can provide detailed portfolios and client testimonials that speak to my work independent of any personal relationships. Good, Marissa said. That kind of preparation tells me you're serious about this transition. I have 3 clients who would be very interested in meeting with you. Are you open to opportunities outside the city? That question surprised me. I'd never considered leaving, had always assumed my career was tied to this particular market, this specific network of contacts and relationships. I'm open to anything, I said, and realized I meant it. Within a week, Marissa had arranged 3 interviews. One with a mid-sized firm downtown that specialized in healthcare marketing, one with a prestigious agency in Chicago that was expanding their tech practice, and one with a boutique consulting firm in San Francisco that worked exclusively with startups and emerging companies. The interviews were revelatory. For the first time in years, I was being evaluated purely on my skills and experience, not on my willingness to be accommodating or my ability to manage someone else's ego. The questions were challenging, the expectations were high, and the conversations were energizing in a way that made me realize how intellectually starved I'd been at Brennan and Associates. All three companies extended offers. The San Francisco opportunity was the most intriguing. Thompson Strategic Consulting was a small firm founded by two women who'd left traditional agencies to create something more innovative and collaborative. They specialized in helping emerging companies develop brand strategies that could scale with rapid growth, and they needed someone to lead their new East Coast expansion. "We're not looking for someone who can fit into our existing structure," said Jen Thompson during our final interview via video call. "We're looking for someone who can help us build something new." The role would be senior partner level, with equity participation and significant autonomy in developing the East Coast practice. Senior partner. The title I'd been working toward for years, the position Marcus had convinced me I wasn't ready for, offered by a company that had evaluated my work without any of the baggage of my personal history. The position would require relocating to either New York or Boston to establish our hub office, Jen continued. "We know that's a big ask, but we believe it's essential to have senior leadership physically present to build client relationships and team culture." "When would you need an answer?" I asked. "We're hoping to have someone in place by March 1st, Jen said. "That gives us time for the transition and allows our new partner to be involved in some key strategic decisions we're making for the next fiscal year." March 1st was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to wrap up my life in a city where I'd spent 3 years making myself smaller, to pack up the remnants of a relationship that had convinced me to doubt my own worth, to move across the country and start building something entirely new. "I'd like to accept," I said, "provisionally, pending our discussion of the specific terms." Jen's smile was radiant. "I was hoping you'd say that. I'll have our attorneys send over the partnership agreement for your review. Welcome to Thompson Strategic, Emma." I spent the rest of that day walking through my neighborhood, seeing it with new eyes. The coffee shop where Marcus and I had had our first official date as a couple. The park where he'd convinced me that my frustrations at work were signs of my own inadequacy rather than his poor management. The upscale restaurants where he'd taken me to celebrate his successes while dismissing my contributions as team efforts. It was time to leave it all behind. My last day at Brennan & Associates was February 15th, exactly 2 weeks after I'd placed my resignation letter on Marcus's desk. I worked from home, as I had for the entire notice period, completing final reports and handing off remaining responsibilities to the team members who would absorb my accounts. At 5 p.m., I sent a polite farewell email to the company mailing list, thanking my colleagues for their collaboration and wishing everyone well. I copied HR on the message, as required by company policy, but didn't send a personal goodbye to Marcus. I figured he'd gotten enough of my attention over the past 3 years. That evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Emma, it's Jessica." The account manager's voice was tense, almost whispered. "I'm calling from my car outside the office. I wanted to let you know what happened today." "Jessica, you don't need to—" "Marcus had a complete meltdown," she interrupted. "After your goodbye email went out, he called an emergency staff meeting. He started ranting about loyalty and professionalism, and how some people don't appreciate the opportunities they've been given." Despite myself, I was curious. What did he say exactly? "He said you'd betrayed the company by leaving during a critical period, that you were clearly influenced by outside forces who didn't understand the industry, and that anyone who followed your example would find themselves blacklisted from serious agencies." The threats were so predictably Marcus that I almost laughed. Even in defeat, he couldn't resist trying to control the narrative, to make my departure about his victimization rather than my empowerment. "How did the team respond?" I asked. "That's the thing," Jessica said, her voice gaining strength. "Nobody bought it. David asked if there were counteroffers being made to retain valued employees. Sarah from design pointed out that losing senior talent right before the Henderson merger might indicate problems with company culture. Even Tom from accounting suggested that exit interviews might help identify areas for improvement." And what did Marcus say to that? "He basically imploded. Started talking about how he'd given you opportunities you never would have received elsewhere, how he'd mentored your career development, how your success was due to his guidance and support." Jessica paused. "Emma, it was uncomfortable to watch. He sounded like a bitter ex-boyfriend, not a professional manager." The irony was perfect. In trying to diminish my departure, Marcus had revealed exactly the kind of person he was. Someone who viewed employees as possessions, who took credit for others' achievements, who couldn't distinguish between professional disappointment and personal rejection. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," I said, and meant it. "Don't be sorry," Jessica replied. "It was actually clarifying. I've been thinking about some things lately about my own career trajectory here. And today's meeting answered a lot of questions I didn't even know I was asking." After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my balcony, looking out over the city lights and thinking about the strange turns life can take. 3 weeks ago, I'd been planning a birthday dinner with my boyfriend, looking forward to a celebration that would mark another year of the life we were building together. Tonight, I was planning a cross-country move to join a company that valued my expertise, preparing to build something entirely my own. The next morning, I started packing. Moving to San Francisco felt like shedding an old skin. Every possession I sorted through was a small decision about who I wanted to be in my new life. The expensive dress I'd bought to impress Marcus's clients. Donated. The books he'd recommended to fix my supposed professional shortcomings. Recycled. The photo albums documenting 3 years of increasingly hollow celebrations and forced smiles. Straight into the trash. I kept the things that were genuinely mine. My grandmother's jewelry, my collection of novels, the art I'd bought because I loved it rather than because it matched someone else's aesthetic. I kept my portfolio, my professional awards, and the business cards from colleagues who'd respected my work regardless of office politics. Most importantly, I kept the small succulent my sister had sent when I was promoted to director. The one person who'd celebrated my achievements without qualification or condition. Thompson Strategic arranged for a corporate relocation service to handle the logistics, but I chose to drive cross-country myself. I wanted the time to process, to experience the physical sensation of distance growing between my old life and my new one. The drive took 4 days. I stopped in Chicago to have dinner with my college friend Maria, who'd built a successful consulting practice and reminded me what it looked like to be passionate about your work. I detoured through Colorado to visit my sister in Denver, who took one look at me and said, "You look like yourself again." I arrived in San Francisco on a Thursday morning in early March, the city emerging from fog like a promise of new possibilities. My temporary corporate housing was a furnished studio in Soma, walking distance from the Thompson Strategic offices, with floor-to-ceiling windows that filled the space with light. That first morning, I stood at those windows with a cup of coffee and called my sister. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Terrifying," I admitted, "and perfect." My first week at Thompson Strategic confirmed that I'd made the right choice. Jen and her co-founder, Katie Morrison, had built exactly the kind of culture I'd been craving. Collaborative but results-driven, supportive but challenging, innovative without being chaotic. More importantly, they treated me like the senior professional I was rather than someone who needed to prove her worth through accommodation and deference. "We hired you because you're excellent at what you do," Jen said during my first team meeting. "We're not interested in managing your development or micromanaging your decisions. We want you to do what you do best and tell us what you need to be successful." It was a revelation to work somewhere that my ideas were engaged with rather than dismissed, where my questions were seen as valuable contributions rather than evidence of inadequacy, where my success was celebrated as a team victory rather than a threat to someone else's authority. Within 6 weeks, I'd signed 3 new clients and developed a strategic framework that would guide the East Coast expansion for the next 2 years. Within 3 months, I was being invited to speak at industry conferences and quoted in trade publications as a thought leader in startup brand development. For the first time in years, I felt professionally alive. But the real test of my transformation came on a Tuesday in late April, when my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't seen in over 2 months. Marcus. I stared at the screen for several rings, debating whether to answer. The old Emma would have been curious, would have wondered if he was calling with news about a family emergency or a professional crisis that required my help. The old Emma would have felt obligated to at least hear what he had to say. The new Emma knew better. I let it go to voicemail, then deleted the message without listening to it. Whatever Marcus wanted to say, I didn't need to hear it. That chapter of my life was closed, and I had no interest in reopening it. But he called again the next day, and the day after that. On Friday, I finally answered. "Hello, Marcus." "Emma." His voice was different, less commanding, more uncertain. Thank you for taking my call. I know you said not to contact you, but I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I wanted to apologize. Apologize. The word I'd waited 3 years to hear, delivered now when it was far too late to matter. Apologize for what, specifically? I asked. For not being more supportive of your career goals. For bringing Natalya to your birthday dinner without discussing it with you first. For not appreciating what I had when I had it. The apology was carefully crafted, hitting the major points while avoiding any admission of systematic manipulation or emotional abuse. It was the kind of non-apology that took responsibility for specific actions while ignoring the underlying patterns that had made those actions inevitable. I see, I said. And what prompted this reflection? I miss you, Marcus said, his voice taking on the vulnerable quality that had once made me want to comfort and reassure him. I miss talking to you, working with you, planning for the future together. I know I made mistakes, but I'd like the chance to make things right. Make things right, I repeated. Tell me, Marcus, what does that look like to you? Well, I know you were frustrated about the promotion situation. David hasn't been working out as senior director. Frankly, several clients have asked specifically to work with you instead. I'd be prepared to offer you the position now, with a significant salary increase and a clear path to partnership. And there it was. Marcus wasn't calling because he'd developed genuine insight into his behavior or deep regret for how he'd treated me. He was calling because my departure had created professional problems he couldn't solve, and he thought offering me what I'd wanted 3 years ago would be enough to bring me back. That's a generous offer, I said, keeping my voice neutral. I've also been thinking about our personal relationship, Marcus continued, clearly encouraged by my lack of immediate rejection. I know I took you for granted, and I want to do better. We could take that vacation we talked about, maybe Italy or Greece, somewhere romantic where we can reconnect. The vacation we'd never actually talked about, the romantic gesture that was being offered as a transaction rather than an expression of genuine love. Marcus, I said gently, I'm in San Francisco now. I'm a senior partner at Thompson Strategic, leading their East Coast expansion. I'm building something entirely new, something that's mine. Silence on the other end of the line. You could do that here, he said finally, but with less conviction now. You could build something new at Brennan and Associates. I'd give you complete autonomy over your accounts, your team, your strategic direction. Under your ultimate authority, I said. Reporting to you, dependent on your approval, subject to your version of what constitutes success. It wouldn't be like that. It would be exactly like that, I interrupted. Because that's who you are, Marcus. You're someone who sees other people as extensions of yourself, as supporting characters in your story. You're calling now not because you've realized that you love me, but because you've realized that you need me. The distinction seemed to genuinely confuse him. What's the difference? He asked. The difference, I said, is everything. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, could practically see him calculating his next approach, searching for the argument that would convince me to return to my previous role in his life. Emma, be realistic, he said finally, falling back on the condescending tone that had once made me question my own judgment. You're throwing away 3 years of history, 3 years of building something together. For what? A startup in a city where you don't know anyone? That's not like you. You're right, I said. It's not like the me you knew. But the me you knew was miserable. She was professionally stagnant, personally diminished, and so convinced of her own inadequacy that she stayed in situations that made her smaller. You weren't inadequate. I know that now, I said. I know it because I'm working somewhere that values my contributions, where my ideas are implemented rather than dismissed, where my success is celebrated rather than minimized. I know it because I'm in a city where no one knows my history, where I get to define myself by my actions rather than my accommodations. So that's it? Marcus asked, his voice hardening with the first hints of anger. You're just going to pretend that none of what we built together mattered? What we built together was your career and your comfort, I said calmly. I'm not going to pretend that was a partnership when it was really an arrangement that served your needs at the expense of mine. The anger broke through then, the carefully controlled facade giving way to the entitled fury of someone who'd never been told no by someone he considered his possession. You know what? Fine. Enjoy your little adventure in California, but don't come crawling back when you realize what you've given up. Don't expect me to be available when your startup bubble bursts and you need a real job again." And there he was, the real Marcus, the one who'd been lurking underneath all the apologies and romantic promises, the man who viewed my professional success as a little adventure, who couldn't imagine that I might thrive without his guidance and support, who needed to believe that my departure would end in failure and regret. "I won't," I said simply. "Goodbye, Marcus." I hung up and immediately blocked his number, then sat in my sun-filled apartment and marveled at how little his anger affected me. 6 months ago, that conversation would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and recrimination. Today, it felt like confirmation that I'd made exactly the right choice. That evening, I met my new colleague David Park for drinks at a rooftop bar in the Mission. David was a senior strategist who'd joined Thompson Strategic 6 months before me, and we'd been collaborating on the East Coast expansion strategy. "You seem different tonight," he said as we settled at a table with views of the bay. "More settled, somehow." "I had a conversation with my ex today," I said. "The first time we've spoken since I moved here." "Ah," David said, raising his glass. "Let me guess, he wanted you back?" "He wanted the version of me that served his purposes back," I said. "The one who didn't ask for too much or expect too much or take up too much space." "And how did that go for him?" "Not well," I admitted, and we both laughed. David was attractive in an easy, uncomplicated way that made me remember what it felt like to enjoy someone's company without constantly monitoring their mood or managing their ego. He was brilliant at his job, but never felt the need to diminish others to prove it. He asked about my work because he was genuinely interested, not because he was looking for ways to redirect credit to himself. "Can I ask you something?" he said as we ordered a second round. "Of course." "Would you be interested in having dinner this weekend? Somewhere that doesn't involve talking about work or clients or strategic frameworks?" It was the first time in years that someone had asked me out without it feeling like a negotiation or a transaction. David wasn't my boss or my subordinate, wasn't someone whose approval I needed or whose rejection I feared. He was simply a man who found me interesting enough to want to spend time with, who saw me as someone worth getting to know rather than someone to be managed or improved. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. That weekend, David took me to a small Italian restaurant in North Beach, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and wine served in mason jars and photos of the owner's family covering every inch of the walls. It was nothing like the upscale establishments Marcus had preferred, with their calculated ambiance and impressive wine lists and careful attention to appearances. It was perfect. We talked about everything and nothing. Books we'd loved, places we wanted to travel, embarrassing childhood stories, career dreams that had nothing to do with impressing anyone else. David listened when I spoke, asked follow-up questions that showed he was actually engaged, shared his own experiences without trying to one-up mine. Most remarkably, he seemed to genuinely like the parts of me that Marcus had found problematic. When I got passionate about a client project, David's eyes lit up with interest rather than dimming with annoyance. When I disagreed with something he said, he leaned in to hear my perspective, rather than dismissing it as evidence of my difficult nature. "You're really good at this," he said as I explained my strategy for the startup we'd been working with. "Good at what?" "Seeing the big picture while keeping track of all the details, it's a rare combination." It was such a simple compliment, but it hit me with unexpected force. For 3 years, Marcus had convinced me that my attention to detail was overthinking, that my big picture perspective was unrealistic, that my ability to hold multiple considerations in mind simultaneously was evidence of indecision rather than thoroughness. David saw those same qualities as strengths. "Thank you," I said, and felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Hey," David said, reaching across the table to touch my hand gently. "Are you okay?" "I'm perfect," I said, and realized it was true. We started seeing each other regularly after that, but it was nothing like the intense, consuming relationship I'd had with Marcus. David and I built something steady and comfortable, based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics, on genuine affection rather than the need to prove our worth to each other. He had his own apartment, his own friends, his own interests that didn't require my participation or approval. When we spent time together, it was because we wanted to, not because one of us felt obligated to manage the other's emotional needs. Most importantly, David seemed to thrive on my success rather than feeling threatened by it. When I landed a major client or received recognition for a project, he celebrated without trying to claim credit or minimize the achievement. When I had ideas that differed from his, he engaged with them intellectually rather than dismissing them personally. "You know what I love about you?" he said one evening as we walked along the Embarcadero after dinner. "What's that?" "You never make yourself smaller to make other people comfortable. You take up exactly the amount of space you deserve, and you don't apologize for it." I stopped walking and stared at him, struck by the observation. "I haven't always been like that," I said. "Well, you are now," David replied, pulling me closer. "And it's spectacular." By the fall, I felt like a completely different person than the one who'd walked out of that birthday dinner 8 months earlier. Thompson Strategic had promoted me to executive partner, recognizing my role in building the East Coast practice into one of the firm's most profitable divisions. I'd been featured in Marketing Week as one of the rising stars reshaping brand strategy, and 3 different headhunters had reached out about senior positions at major agencies. But the most important change wasn't professional, it was personal. I'd remembered who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to be someone else's version of acceptable. That's why I wasn't entirely surprised when Jessica called me on a Thursday afternoon in October. "Emma, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," she said, sounding nervous. "I got your number from your LinkedIn profile. I wanted to let you know that I'm leaving Brennan and Associates." "Congratulations," I said, settling back in my office chair. "Where are you headed?" "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about that. I know Thompson Strategic is expanding, and I've been following your work on social media. The projects you're posting about look incredible, exactly the kind of strategic thinking I've been wanting to do." It turned out that Jessica wasn't the only one. Over the past few months, 3 other former colleagues had reached out through various channels, all expressing interest in the kind of work Thompson Strategic was doing, all noting that my social media presence showed a level of professional engagement and excitement they hadn't seen from me during my time at Brennan and Associates. "What's the situation there now?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. "It's not good," Jessica admitted. "We lost the Henderson merger when David couldn't manage the complexity of the account integration. 2 other major clients have left in the past quarter, both citing concerns about leadership stability and cultural fit. And Marcus has been—" She trailed off, clearly unsure how much to share. "You can tell me," I said. "I'm not going to share anything you say with anyone else." "He's been erratic," Jessica said finally. "Micromanaging projects he used to delegate, undermining decisions he previously approved, constantly talking about how the company used to function better when it had more loyal employees. It's created a really toxic atmosphere." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. Whatever my personal history with Marcus, I didn't wish professional failure on anyone. "The thing is," Jessica continued, "several of us have been talking, and we think the problem isn't just Marcus's management style. We think he's struggling with some personal issues, and it's affecting his judgment across the board." Personal issues, I could guess what that meant. "Jessica, I appreciate you letting me know about the situation, but I hope you understand that I can't get involved in anything related to Marcus or Brennan and Associates. That chapter of my life is closed." "I understand completely," Jessica said quickly. "I wasn't asking you to get involved. I wanted you to know that the way you left, the way you refused to let him minimize your decision or convince you to stay, it's been inspiring to watch from the outside. It's made some of us realize that we have options too." After we hung up, I sat in my office looking out at the San Francisco skyline and thinking about the ripple effects of the choices we make. When I'd walked out of that birthday dinner, I'd been thinking only about my own situation, my own need to reclaim my dignity and autonomy. I hadn't considered that my departure might give other people permission to examine their own professional circumstances, to question whether they were accepting less than they deserved. That evening, I told David about Jessica's call over dinner at our usual spot in the mission. "How does it feel?" he asked, "knowing that things aren't going well for your ex?" I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I might have felt guilty or worried, might have wondered if there was something I could do to help, or if I bore some responsibility for the situation. Honestly, I said, it feels like information about someone else's life. I hope he figures things out, but not because I feel any obligation to be involved in that process. David smiled. That sounds very healthy. It feels healthy, I agreed. It feels like I finally understand the difference between caring about someone and feeling responsible for them. That night, as I lay in my own bed in my own apartment in a city where I'd built a life that was entirely mine, I thought about the woman who'd attended that birthday dinner 8 months earlier. She'd been so concerned with being accommodating, so afraid of taking up too much space, so convinced that her worth was dependent on someone else's approval. I barely recognized her anymore. The final piece of closure came in December, when Marissa Klein called with an unexpected piece of news. I thought you'd be interested to know, she said, that Brennan and Associates has been acquired by Hartwell Communications. The official announcement went out this morning. Hartwell was a large corporate agency known for buying smaller firms and absorbing their client lists while eliminating redundant staff. It was the kind of acquisition that usually meant significant layoffs and the end of whatever culture had existed at the acquired company. Do you know what that means for the current employees? I asked. From what I'm hearing, they're keeping about half the staff and consolidating operations into their existing offices. Marcus will stay on as a senior director for 2 years, then he's expected to transition out. Senior director, the same level I'd held 3 years earlier, the position Marcus had convinced me I wasn't ready to grow beyond. I'm sure that's a difficult transition for him, I said diplomatically. Maybe, Marissa said. But from a market perspective, it's good news for everyone else. Hartwell is already reaching out to former Brennan employees to see who might be interested in freelance consulting arrangements. Your name came up specifically. Apparently, several former clients have requested to work with you on future projects. It was a perfect circle. The clients I'd served at Brennan and Associates, the relationships I'd built despite Marcus's attempts to control and diminish my contributions, were now seeking me out as an independent professional. Are you interested in taking on some consulting work? Marissa asked. Let me think about it, I said. I'm pretty committed to Thompson Strategic, but I might be able to work something out for the right projects. That weekend, David and I drove up to Napa for a long weekend at a bed and breakfast I'd found online. It was the kind of spontaneous trip I'd never been able to take during my years with Marcus, when every plan had to be cleared through his schedule and aligned with his priorities. On Saturday evening, we sat on the porch of our cottage with glasses of wine and watched the sun set over the vineyard. I have something to tell you, David said, and something in his tone made me look at him more closely. What's that? Thompson Strategic has been approached about opening a London office, he said. Jen asked if I'd be interested in leading the international expansion. My heart sank. David had become such an important part of my new life, such a steady source of support and companionship, that the thought of losing him felt like a return to the isolation I'd worked so hard to escape. That's an incredible opportunity, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. It is, David agreed, but I'd only be interested if you'd consider coming with me. I stared at him, wine glass halfway to my lips. As in moving to London together? As in Thompson Strategic is looking for someone to co-lead the international expansion, David said, grinning at my expression. Someone with experience in both East Coast and West Coast markets, someone who understands startup culture but can also work with established brands. You're offering me a job, I said slowly. I'm offering you an adventure, David corrected. The job part is just details. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds before starting to laugh. A year ago, I was afraid to take a weekend trip without checking with my boyfriend first, I said. Now you're asking me to move to another continent. Different boyfriend, David pointed out. Different life, different Emma. Different everything, I agreed. We spent the rest of the weekend talking through the logistics, the timeline, the implications of such a major life change. But underneath all the practical considerations, I felt the same crystalline clarity I'd experienced that night after the birthday dinner, the sense that I was being offered exactly what I needed at exactly the right time. On Monday morning, I walked into Jen's office and accepted the London position. I was hoping you'd say yes, Jen said, pulling out a bottle of champagne she'd apparently had waiting in her desk drawer. David said he wouldn't take the assignment without you, and frankly, we need both of your skill sets to make this work. When do we leave? I asked. March 1st, Jen said. Exactly 1 year after you started here. Seems poetic somehow. That afternoon, I called my sister to share the news. London, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Emma, that's incredible. How do you feel about it? Terrified, I admitted, and perfect. Just like when you moved to San Francisco? Exactly like that. Then you know you're making the right choice, she said. The Emma I've always known was never meant to make herself smaller for anyone else's comfort. She was meant to take up space, to build things, to go on adventures that scare her in the best possible way. That evening, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my San Francisco apartment, looking out over the city that had helped me remember who I was, and thought about the journey that had brought me here. 18 months ago, I'd been a woman who accepted humiliation at her own birthday party, who questioned her own perceptions rather than trusting her instincts, who believed that love meant accepting less than she deserved. Today, I was someone who walked away from situations that didn't serve her, who built partnerships based on mutual respect, who said yes to opportunities that excited her even when they were terrifying. Tomorrow, I would start planning for London, for the next chapter of a life that was entirely my own creation. And somewhere in this city, probably in several different offices and coffee shops and wine bars, there were other women who were just beginning to realize that they didn't have to accept less than they deserved, that they could walk away from situations that made them smaller, that their worth wasn't dependent on someone else's approval. I thought about Marcus, probably sitting in his soon-to-be former office, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. I hoped he would eventually understand that his downfall hadn't been caused by my departure or anyone else's disloyalty, but by his own inability to see the people around him as anything more than supporting characters in his personal story. But mostly, I didn't think about him at all. I thought about London, about David, about the projects we'd build and the life we'd create together. I thought about the woman I'd become and the woman I was still becoming. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I went to sleep that night excited about what tomorrow would bring. The last communication I ever received from Marcus was a LinkedIn message that arrived 2 days before I left for London. It was brief, formal, the kind of message you send when you want to maintain the appearance of professionalism while making one final attempt at control. Emma, I heard through mutual connections that you're relocating to London for an exciting new opportunity. Despite how things ended between us, I want you to know that I wish you success in your future endeavors. If you ever need a reference or recommendation for your work at Brennan & Associates, please don't hesitate to reach out. Best regards, Marcus. I read it twice, marveling at the careful construction. The implication that he was graciously offering forgiveness for how things ended, as if I'd been the one who'd violated boundaries or caused problems. The subtle reminder that he still had power to impact my professional reputation through references and recommendations. The suggestion that my success was an opportunity rather than something I'd earned through my own abilities. It was so perfectly Marcus that I almost admired the craftsmanship. I deleted the message without responding. 2 weeks later, I was standing in the lobby of Thompson Strategic's new London office, a converted Victorian warehouse in Shoreditch with exposed brick walls and enormous windows that filled the space with light. David was beside me, both of us slightly jet-lagged, but energized by the possibility of building something entirely new. "No regrets?" he asked, slipping his hand into mine. I looked around at the empty office that would soon be filled with brilliant people working on innovative projects, at the man who saw my ambition as an asset rather than a threat, at the life I'd created by refusing to accept anything less than I deserved. "No regrets," I said, and I meant it completely. 2 years later, I received an invitation to speak at the Marketing Professionals Conference in my old city. The topic was Building Resilient Career Strategies in Dynamic Markets, and the organizers specifically mentioned that they were looking for speakers who had successfully navigated major career transitions. I almost declined. I'd built such a full, satisfying life in London that returning to the scene of my former diminishment felt unnecessary, even counterproductive. But then I thought about Jessica and the other colleagues who'd reached out over the years, about the women who might be sitting in audiences wondering if they had options they couldn't see. I accepted the invitation. The conference was held at the downtown convention center, and I arrived an hour before my session to get familiar with the space and test the technology. As I was setting up my presentation, a young woman approached the stage. "Miss Chen?" she said hesitantly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Sarah Kim, and I'm a director at Hartwell Communications. I've been following your work since you moved to London, and I just wanted to say thank you." "Thank you for what?" "For showing people like me that it's possible to leave," she said simply. 3 years ago, I was working for someone who made me feel like I was lucky to have a job, like my ideas weren't valuable, like I should be grateful for whatever opportunities I was given. Watching how you built your career after leaving Brennan and Associates gave me the courage to start building mine. Sarah, it turned out, was one of several former Brennan and Associates employees who'd left during the Hartwell transition and gone on to build successful careers elsewhere. She was now leading digital strategy for major international brands and had recently been approached about starting her own consultancy. "The thing is," she said, "I don't think any of us realized how much we'd accepted until we saw someone refuse to accept it. You walking away from that situation, it gave us permission to examine our own." After she left, I stood on that empty stage and thought about the ripple effects of the choices we make, about how refusing to diminish ourselves can give other people permission to take up the space they deserve. When it was time for my presentation, I looked out at an audience of several hundred marketing professionals and realized that I wasn't nervous. I wasn't worried about being judged or found inadequate. I was simply excited to share what I'd learned about building a career and a life on your own terms. I never saw Marcus in the audience, though I knew he might be there. By then, it didn't matter. He'd become simply another person I used to know, someone from a previous chapter of my life that I'd closed completely. After my session, as I was packing up my materials, someone called my name from the back of the auditorium. I looked up to see David walking toward me, having flown in from London to surprise me. "How did it go?" he asked, pulling me into a hug. "Perfect," I said. "Everything is absolutely perfect." And standing there in that convention center in the city where I'd once made myself so small, I'd nearly disappeared entirely, surrounded by people who saw my success as inspiring rather than threatening, holding the hand of a man who celebrated my ambitions instead of minimizing them, I realized that I'd finally built the life I'd always deserved. I just hadn't known I deserved it until I stopped accepting less.